Hello and welcome to the Home Assistant Podcast. This is a special podcast today. We're joined today by the one and only Paulus. Welcome back.
Hey, what's going on?
Well, you tell us. It's been quite a while since we've had you on the podcast.
That's right.
Nabu Casa's tripled their employees, and there's been so many cool new features coming out since the last time we had you on. So, yeah, it's been a while.
It has been a while. I don't remember when the last time was. Was it in 2019?
Yeah, I think so, with Pascal, I think.
Yeah.
Man, we should have researched this before the podcast recorded.
Yeah. Maybe for the next time we have you on, Will.
This episode is sponsored by Home Assistant Cloud by Nabu Casa. Easily and securely access your local Home Assistant instance remotely for a small monthly fee that also supports the Home Assistant project. Configuration is via the user interface, so no fiddling with router settings, SSL certificates, or YAML. So I think the theme we usually have with you is how's version 1 coming along, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's coming along pretty nice. I think that we've been doing so much polishing and so much things have been moving faster and getting faster and bugs getting squashed. In the last couple of releases, I think this year it really has picked up. I think the biggest thing we've been working on is that we've been revamping the configuration screen.
Yeah.
So one of the things that have been going on is that we, at the State of the Union, I talked about how we grouped it into inputs and outputs, where the inputs are the devices, the entities, your the people, and your integrations, and the outputs are the scripts, the scenes, the automation stuff, pretty much. And so we have regrouped the whole configuration screen by those concepts. So there's a block of inputs, and then you have the 4 tabs of the integrations, devices, and we've been really working in the last 2 releases to really, and in 109 it will continue to really get the inputs really solid. So we added logos, we have this thing called related items. So you click on a device, you see which config entry is part of it, which entities are part of it, in which automations it's used, in which scenes it's used, scripts it's used. And that's, this is all, of course, part of making it easier, which was the overarching message, right, from the State of the Union. And I think that's the, for 1.0, the goal is it has to be easy. And I think this is where, with the config panel, we're getting really close. I think the biggest points that are left is to redo the main dashboard, because it's just now a list of options. We want to get that some more information right off the bat. So it's easier to know where to click. We want to integrate the supervisor panel into the configuration screen, because right now, especially now that it's renamed to supervisor, people look at why is there a panel in my sidebar called supervisor, which everything it does is related to settings, right? So it should be in the developer tools, contains some tabs that are not developer tools. So the info panel should be part of settings somewhere. And I know these are kind of things that where settings is going, which is really 1.0 is really about the settings screen and being able to administrate Home Assistant. Because for the usage wise, right? Lovelace is very solid. I think that we just added multiple dashboards, so that was really the finishing touch for Lovelace. I think for 1.0 was to be able to be able to get multiple dashboards, and I think eventually we need to get.
Which is going to be awesome, by the way.
Yeah.
Multiple dashboards is a great feature to have.
Right. And I think, the next step is once you have multiple dashboards, we can be I want to show this dashboard when I open the app and I am not in the home, right? So you can have an away dashboard that you get seen when you open the app, and I want to be able to have certain people see certain dashboards and these kind of cool things.
Yeah.
But that's, those are not built yet, but those are now all possible. And it's going to be easier to be done based on because now the foundation of dashboards is there. And so, I know Home Assistant 1.0 is getting, it's chugging along pretty nicely, I would say. And I can't say when it's going to be out. I think with this whole pandemic, everything is also a little different.
Delayed and pushed out.
So we'll see. I think it's the biggest thing. But it is moving there, and it's getting better.
That's awesome. That's good to hear.
So talking of the pandemic, it's obviously April 2020 for people maybe listening to this in the future. Everyone's locked in at home around the world. How's Nabu Casa going with that? I'm guessing there's no real change in terms of working from home because everyone's remote anyway.
Right. I mean, employee-wise, we're all been working from home. It's mainly like our partners that are at home, the kids that are at home. But for now, it seems everybody has been able to cope with it well. I think we haven't seen the numbers, like it's too early on, so we don't know how like the people supporting the Home Assistant project through Nabu Casa is going to be impacted, right? Because obviously when the economy is shrinking and we're all at home, right? Like, who needs a remote UI when you're at home? But I think I think for now it's going well. We just had 2 new people come on full time. We had Martin. Martin has been, of course, around for a long time. For anyone that has contributed code, Martin was like one of the main reviewer guys. He's been really like helpful always, and he's now. Obviously also still doing reviews, and mainly when we get people full time, it's the stuff they were already doing, they just continue doing that. So he's doing a lot of reviews, but he's also focusing on Z-Wave. So we've been working last December. I was in Denmark because my in-law, my wife is from Denmark, and so I was visiting my in-laws. And then I also stopped by Copenhagen, where Silicon Labs is, with the Z-Wave office. So I stopped and talked to the Z-Wave people. They were really, friendly. They liked Home Assistant. Some of them used Home Assistant, and they want to get Home Assistant like on board to get like a certified Z-Wave experience. And not too long after that, like in the beginning of January, Silicon Labs announced that a lot of the protocols of Z-Wave, like the things that were first held by Silicon Labs are now being donated to the Z-Wave Alliance. So Z-Wave is opening up more, with the goal also that eventually, we want to get Open Z-Wave, be able to get Home Assistant certified by using Open Z-Wave as an library. So that's something that, this is like long term we're working on, but so now Martin is focusing on wrapping up our new Z-Wave integration. So we announced this at the State of the Union as well. We're working on where we've been working with the Open Z-Wave team to get a new Z-Wave daemon that communicates over MQTT with Home Assistant. So it's a lot more stable. It means that if you restart Home Assistant, Z-Wave network stays up, right? Which was one of the things that could take like a long time to reboot. And it means it will be easier to stay up to date with the latest versions of Open Z-Wave. And that's something that Martin is working on right now as well to like wrap up.
So will that be a separate like a system running alongside Home Assistant Core? Like you mentioned MQTT. So does that mean every Home Assistant instance will need an MQTT broker somewhere in the back end?
Yes. If you want to use Z-Wave, you will have to use MQTT. And so, for Home Assistant, it's easy because we have the add-ons, right? So there will be an Open Z-Wave daemon, which is an application, of course, and the MQTT broker. Both of them will be add-ons. And so we have this auto-discovery stuff in add-ons nowadays. So like the moment you install right now already the MQTT broker, it will configure Home Assistant. So the same thing will be happening with Z-Wave, right? And I think my goal is that if you plug in a USB stick that is Z-Wave compatible, we ask the user, do you want to set up Z-Wave? And then we do everything. Like, it's just done.
Right. So kind of like just an easy, like wizard, next, finish, go.
Right.
Like you don't have to go in, find the device name,
exactly,
put all that stuff in. Okay, that's awesome. Yeah.
So that's the goal. And that's like, that's what Martin is working towards, right? Is that like being able to just plug in a Z-Wave stick and get it going.
Yeah.
And then this infrastructure of like mapping like USB sticks to add-ons and integrations and all that stuff, we want to do the same thing for Zigbee.
Yeah.
Zigbee is, of course, a lot more mature already. We have a great team working on that. But that's something once we have all these pieces linked up where we can say, hey, this add-on and this integration, then why not do it for other stuff?
Yeah. So how do you see like at some point, do you see more importance or more priority given to Z-Wave versus Zigbee versus, because Zigbee, for those who don't know, Zigbee is fully open as a standard and so on. Z-Wave today is still pseudo licensed, right? So
I think, well, the thing with Z-Wave, the problem the licensing part was that there was only one manufacturer of chips.
yeah,
And obviously that's one of the reasons why a lot of big vendors are not using it, because if that one manufacturer would increase the price, then you have nowhere else to go.
yeah,
And this is something where Z-Wave is like trying to get something going with like opening up like parts of their stack.
yeah,
And so I think they're, at least some other chip manufacturer will probably step up as well, because they're owned by Silicon Labs. And Silicon Labs, I mean, they make 80% of all Zigbee chips in the world, I think, something like this.
wow.
So I think that Silicon Labs' goal is to just make more chips. They don't really care about the protocol, right? I don't think they care to make a lot of money off just licensing Z-Wave. They just want to produce the best chips.
Yeah.
And then you buy their chips.
Yeah, they're a hardware company first kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah, which makes sense.
So for now, of course, Martin is going to focus on Z-Wave just because there's no active developers, and but once Z-Wave is like integrated, right, we can like look at other stuff. But for now, I mean, there's enough work to do to just get Z-Wave up and going. And we're, compared to the Zigbee experience, we're like way behind. So
yeah, and I'm a Zigbee user, but I've heard the same thing from the Z-Wave front, right? Just you know, a lot of issues there, or not necessarily issues, but just experience issues, if anything, right?
No, yeah, I'm a Zigbee user as well.
Yeah. So well, that's cool. So, I mean, one of the other things we kind of wanted to talk about was the elephant in the room, where so there was a blog post that came out, Paulus. I'm not sure if you wrote that or one of the other guys wrote that, but basically around moving to the UI for adding devices, right? I know I saw a lot of stuff, Twitter, Facebook, the works, right, on the internet as a whole, around you know, there it sounds like there might be some misconceptions, and maybe we can clarify why you're taking that route and kind of the logic behind those decisions, right?
Right. Yeah, so this ADR 10, Architectural Decision Record 10, this is how we make kind of like set up like new rules for the Home Assistant organization for contributions. This all happens in the architecture repository. Generally, this time we did go through an ADR, but we did all the prep work in like with just we have a Discord channel just for all the people that are active contributors to the project. And because one thing that we've been noticing, like, you know, I can actually tell you how this all started, right? Like before we dive in, like what we're changing is that, you know, we've been, I mean, actually if we want to start at the very beginning, we have to go back to 2017. So in 2017, we only had YAML configuration. Everything was done in YAML. And there were a lot of issues with this. And I think the issues were, for example, how to deal with discovery. There was no like, you know, YAML is the source of truth. We cannot write to YAML because you lose your comments, you lose your formatting, all your includes, all that stuff.
Yeah.
So we would discover things, but then the moment you had to configure it, you couldn't because it was discovered. There was no config. Then you had to actually add it to your configuration yourself, and then you had to go to discovery and say ignore this, because discoveries would otherwise override what you had manually configured. And so it meant that every user going in had to, you know, learn about this, and was like, initially a user would like open up Home Assistant, would have all these discovered things, and be like, okay, now I want to tweak some settings, and then it gets into like this hell. It was a really steep curve once you have it like installed, once you had to dive into YAML. And so to solve this, we introduced what we call config entries. And config entries is just that the integration's configuration itself is stored in like a piece of data. That piece of data is managed by Home Assistant. So, you know, and this config entry, to create it, you know, we had different paths that like all lead to the same. So there was We could import it from YAML. If it got discovered, we would open like a wizard, like a config flow that guided you through, hey, we discovered this. Do you want to add it to Home Assistant? And do you want to like yes or no? Nowadays, you can also ignore discovered entries. And then, of course, there's the manually starting a config flow to create a config entry, right? So you can just go to the add integration button. And then later, once it's been set up, you can use the options flow to manage options in your config entry. And, there's been, once we added that, it became easier for Home Assistant to manage these things because, we have one set of settings and we know, as an integration, you know where those settings are. You can, once it's discovered, you can easily check against those settings. We can write to it. But of course, we were still supporting YAML. So we did always a YAML import when the integration started up. But the problem is with YAML is that we don't always know which YAML configuration belongs to which configuration entry. If you configure like 5 times a certain integration, then how do we know which integration maps to which config entry?
Right.
And then, so this started to become more complicated. And so at some point, it became no longer mandatory to add YAML support. Like people were like, no, we'll just use a UI. Because there's certain authentication methods also that, it doesn't work with YAML. I think the biggest example is, for example, take Ring. To log into Ring, you first put in the username password. And the second step is that you need to put in a 2-factor authentication code.
Yeah.
So if this was done in YAML, you would have to put your username and password in YAML. And then we would have to show a UI anyway, right, to get you the 2-factor authentication code. And then, you can continue and, but you still had your configuration, your username and password in your YAML.
Yeah.
Now, with our config flows, we are able to not even store your username and password anymore. Because we take your username and your password, ask for your 2FA code, then we get a set of tokens, and we don't even store the password anymore. We just store that token, that little piece of information. And the other thing was something like the Philips Hue hub, right? The Philips Hue hub had, you have to press this button on your hub for it to get configured. And it also meant there was already a UI flow for that as well. And so these config entries, this evolved over time, right? Since, so I think beginning of 2018, we introduced config entries. And this has been growing and growing. And so at some point, what started happening is that certain big integrations, integration with a lot of options, or integrations that are very complicated with a lot of moving parts, like a Unify, decided to I don't want to manage all the YAML anymore because it's very complicated. Because YAML gets loaded, we have to map up all the options, write all the options to the config entries, then apply those options while we're running, etc. And so they decided I don't want to maintain this. These are volunteers, and so they decided I want to drop the YAML. And then we're like, okay. And so they dropped the YAML, and then we got shitstorms. And so each time we had a integration say, hey, I'm going to stop maintaining the way that you can configure it through YAML.
Right.
Because the UI experience is just a lot better. People will be angry. And at some point we realized that as the Home Assistant organization, by not having clear rules, we were opening up our contributors to these shitstorms, right? Because if these contributors would just say, hey, I just follow the rules, blame them, then the organization gets the blame, and not these individual people that are doing it in their spare time. And we saw comments from maintainers that are not willing to make certain changes because they would get personally attacked. And that's when we realized that, okay, this is wrong. We need to protect our contributors. They are our whole project is built. The majority of the people are contributors. They are people doing this in their spare time. And if we cannot protect them, then there's something wrong, right? This is not good. And so that's where we decided, in collaboration with all these contributors, to create ADR10.
Right.
And so with ADR10, the thing that has changed is that if an integration, so there's first in the ADR10 we lay out there's 7 different types of integrations. Integrations that communicate with devices, integrations that communicate with services. Devices is Philips Hue, Services could be Spotify or Ring, which through the service you talk to
The device.
device, but it could also be like a weather API or something like this.
Yep.
There are integrations that communicate with like transports. So an MQTT it transports data, but it doesn't tell you how to you have to write your own protocol on top of it.
Yeah.
So, MQTT is an example of that. Then we have integrations that take data that's in Home Assistant and process it. So there's like the stats or the derivative integrations, the Bayesian sensor, these ones. Then we have integrations that do control, so that help with control. So there's scripts and there's scenes. And then, of course, we have the automation integration. So the automation one where you can write your own automations. We have the alert one, the device sunlight trigger integration. They're very specific use case integrations. And in ADR 10, we say the first two, the ones that where you communicate with devices and the ones where you communicate with services, those will no longer be configurable through YAML. And so It means that moving forward, we will no longer taking any contributions of integrations that that have YAML as a config option, or it can only be configured through the UI. All the other ones, though, we've developed also in the beginning of this year a new way of how we configure things. So this was really based on our experience with Lovelace, where for the people that are not familiar, in Lovelace you can have two different ways of configuring Lovelace, either through the UI or through YAML. And both options have for the YAML, we have a reload option. So the moment you change your YAML, you hit reload in Lovelace and you get the latest data without restarting. Yep. Or if you make it to the UI, you don't have to restart at all. And with Lovelace dashboards, you can even per dashboard pick, it's a YAML dashboard or it's a storage dashboard. So that way you can, you can experience your storage and then write it to YAML when you're doing more advanced stuff or whatever, right? And so we actually extracted a set of reusable helpers out of this, and we've been applying it to a lot of integrations. So all the input integrations, input boolean, text, date, number, they have all now the same approach. So all these integrations you can control through the UI, or you can manage through YAML.
Right.
You look at and you can reload them as well. So we just introduced a new dashboard for the UI part, I think 108, maybe 107, where if you go to config, you go to automations and you click on helpers, you can add these helpers. And this approach is actually what in ADR 10 is also decided we're going to put, the goal is to add this to all the other integrations, right? So it's a way where you can manage it both through the UI, and through YAML. And I mean, that's pretty much ADR 10 in a nutshell.
Right. So I know there was a lot of flack around power users, where the power users feel like they're losing control over, basically building some kind of a pipeline, running it through there, whatever that is, or just the ability to kind of keystroke do stuff, right? So I mean, most of the stuff, like you said, through this kind of a flow will end up in the .storage folder. It'll be stored in there. From a backups perspective, it's still you still have the ability to back up, correct?
Right. I mean, if you need to back up the storage directory anyway when you make a backup. Yeah. Because it contains your users, the hashed passwords, right? Like if you want to have the same users, the same. There's a lot of settings in there. Like your entity IDs are mapped to the internal codes that we get from the devices and services.
Right. So all that can still be so there is still a level of control that you still have, right?
Right.
And I mean, if you really want to, you can go in and manually modify the JSON files and stuff. Not that that's recommended in any which way.
Well, exactly. I mean, yes, you can manually change the JSON files and then restart. I mean, I think, there could be added more admin APIs, right? If people want to have these kind of administration stuff. Yeah. For I want a certain way to specify it, but because the problem that we have is that there's a lot of stuff that people want to put in their YAML that we don't know in advance what they will be. So take for example, you want to, the entity registry. People have been saying, can I put the entity registry in YAML? And then the first thing I'm saying, like, how do we identify the entity? And they're like, well, entity ID, of course. But entity IDs can change, right? Like people actually use the entity registry to change IDs.
Yep.
And so how then are you identifying something that is only in like, the only way you can identify it is by the internal identifiers that we get from the integration. So the moment we connect to your Philips Hue hub, we get like your device serial number, right? And that's going to be our internal identifier.
Right.
So yes, I guess we can like have an API with all these internal identifiers, but it's not going to be pretty because there's like 3 lines of identifiers for each N3 and stuff like this. Yeah. And I mean, it seems that like people are not. I mean, I see a lot of the infrastructure as code like comments, but I mean, no one ever works on it. Nobody's ever mentioning it besides like in the comments when things are less useful for that. It's we are open for API changes if people have proposals on how to like integrate this into Home Assistant in a sensible way. Which is for us really the goal is that like as I said in the State of the Union, we have to make it easier. We have to make sure that your authentication credentials don't end up in your YAML and then you put your YAML online and you share your logins. That's one thing that is really important to us because we've seen people accidentally share their authentication information. And then people say, well, Home Assistant leaked my credentials, or people start using GitHub and it's their first time GitHub, so it's not we have to make sure that we protect them from not accidentally putting things online, because it's very difficult to remove your repository. Like a lot of people think if they're new to GitHub, because it's version controlled, that if they just delete it and then commit it again, no one can see it. But if you go through Git history and stuff, right? Like,
you can still pull the file.
Yeah, and I mean, this is how Git works, of course, but this is something we need to help users like not make these mistakes.
Yeah,
and the best way to not make these mistakes is just to not be able to put it there.
Yep. Which is fair, right? And again, from I mean, there was a large Facebook thread around this as well in the Home Assistant Facebook page around why are we losing it kind of thing. And one of my comments around this was, again, you talked about it, which is around authenticating these devices or authenticating to these services, whether it's like you used the example of Ring. Right, where again, there's 2-factor authentication, there's SSO, there's all these different methods that would make it pretty difficult for consuming via YAML, right? So that's to me, that's as somebody who is concerned about security, who is concerned about again, my credentials being compromised and such. For me, I would rather take the UI path than this, if that means I'm more secure, right?
So I'm going to chime in here, and I'm going to say, first of all, I'm probably the typical power user that you are referring to. I prefer YAML over everything. I always get a bit scared when I see things only going UI only, and I feel as though from a user point of view, especially for a Home Assistant user point of view, you've got to remember that we are people that prefer, open devices, and, we don't like cloud only things. And then sort of as I see things moving into the storage folder, to me, that is Home Assistant taking control away from me from something that I can then, and I don't know what Home Assistant's doing in that storage folder. I try not to edit the JSON files. I don't want to edit JSON files at all because that's something I don't want to touch. So I'm guessing in terms of, from my point of view, if Home Assistant's managing all that storage folder, how do we go about having to, for example, reverting back to a previous version of Home Assistant? If I upgrade and then changes are made in that storage folder, can I then downgrade if there is an issue with one of my integrations in a newer version without problems? To me, that seems like a black hole.
Right. It's so generally what happens right now in like if we go look at, I mean, the storage folder contains many different pieces of information, and it's like cache, it's like we store the entities and these kind of things. And it's if you look at like downgrading, the way we write our code is that older versions won't crash if they find new keys. So that means that like if a new key is added to like a specific object, an older version won't crash. One thing that can happen is that, with config entries, you don't have any breaking changes anymore in the configuration format, like ever. Because a Home Assistant owns a configuration object, it means that an author of an integration is responsible for migrating if they have like breaking change. And generally there doesn't happen to be many breaking changes anymore. I think the one breaking change just happened in, I would say it's called Air Visual. But anyway, this integration initially had one config entry for all the different like locations you want to track. And then the author decided, no, it's actually better if we have multiple config entries, one per location. And so in that case, they did do a version, like a migration. And so they went from like version 1 to version 2. And then Home Assistant will make sure we migrate your config entries. And in this case, this would actually not work with your, when you downgrade again, your Air Visual wouldn't work. That's the only downside, because we had to change, migrate that the config entry version. But generally, all the other formats are pretty static, so we're not gonna like change those. I think if we ever gonna change the core format, data formats that you really cannot roll back, that will probably be if we do like major version releases, right? So once we release 1.0, then like the structure is frozen. Like we can add keys, but we can still go back and forward. But of course, if 2.0 comes around, we will include the migration path, but not a migration path backwards, probably.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think, the only thing now, for example, if Air Visual would not work, if you would go to 109 and then go back to 107 or something. But generally, that would be the only type of breaking change that would happen. And I think the solution there would be to just delete the config entry and set it up again. Yeah, there's still some breaking changes. I think you would have the same kind of breaking changes if you would migrate back from like a 109 to 107 if, some YAML format has changed, for example.
Very true, yes. But I'm guessing in a YAML sense, I could, assuming that I had done a GitHub repo, I could then just go back and migrate that back in.
True.
Which is obviously the trade-off of convenience in the UI versus YAML having to manage, own your integration.
On the migrating config entry part, we've had this logic since the beginning, and I think there's only been used 3 times now. So it's like very, very rare.
Right.
Generally, like we just get the authentication, and then the rest is can be happen through an options flow or whatever. There's very seldom that there's a need for config entries to be like migrated.
Right. And so we're seeing a lot of integrations now, sort of, like you're bringing in scene editor and, the automation builder that can also have, both YAML and the UI. With ADR10, are you solidifying that YAML in some form, or how it is moving forward, will be here to stay? You're not going to eventually get rid of the YAML automations, for example, or the YAML scene builder?
Right. No, those are not going to go away. I mean, this is also something I mentioned at the State of the Union when there's a whole section in the State of the Union where I talk about sharing. And, we know sharing is super important, and like it's something that drives a lot of our community. And so anything that is meant to be shared will also remain to be done in YAML, but it's also going to be possible through the UI. So it's a choice. And so because right now there's going to be a set of users that just don't feel comfortable with Git, GitHub, these kind of things. And so for them, sharing that sharing is just not really an option. And so these people can still look at other people that have shared their YAML. And actually, if you go to the automation editor, you can actually turn on YAML mode. You just see the automation as a YAML, and you can paste in like automations that you found on the internet. And that's something. Well, actually, I I don't know if you can do it on the full automation or just per automation block, like per trigger or condition. We did have a contribution for it, but I don't know if it went through. But I mean, that is the goal, that like you can, with Lovelace as well, you can like, hey, I want to see my whole Lovelace configuration that I manage through storage as YAML in the front end. That's possible too. And so you can still paste in stuff, but having it just be done in YAML, that's not going to go away. Like that's a really valuable part of like what Home Assistant is. And I think that would be silly to remove.
Yeah. And that's kind of key, right? In terms of all the stuff that's all the conversations that are happening. So
yeah, and I mean that is why we also added these collection helpers that allow us to have both YAML and storage-based automations. Well, actually, we don't use it for automation right now. We use it for like the input boolean, input date, input text. Automations actually use our old hybrid format where we have one dedicated YAML file that we write to, which we're probably going to keep.
And for someone that's just starting out and maybe they want to put up their Home Assistant on a public repo like GitHub or something, will I be committing my storage folder or leaving it out?
So you leave it out. So the storage folder is not something that you need to share. Because it doesn't contain your automations, it doesn't contain your scripts, it doesn't contain your scenes. Like all that stuff will be in your YAML. Storage contains your authentication, your
the private stuff.
The private stuff, yes.
Makes sense.
Right. Was there what else kind of are you guys working on, Paulus, or what else did you want to fill us in on?
Yeah, we're really we've been working with Google on implementing the Google Local Sdk.
Okay.
And so the Google Local Sdk is an interesting feature from Google Assistant, where Google Assistant will be able to, once you have the Home Assistant skill, or I think it's action in their world, configured for your Google Assistant. And if Google Assistant then detects Home Assistant on your local network, then it will talk to Home Assistant to see if it can like identify with it, to say, hey, is this my Home Assistant installation? And if that is correct, then whenever you talk to Google Assistant, it will be able to send commands directly from the Google Assistant, like the Google Home Mini, for example, directly to Home Assistant. So that will make it slightly faster because it wouldn't have to go through a Home Assistant cloud.
That's interesting.
Yeah, they announced it last year at Google I/O, and so we jumped on the bandwagon right away. We've had it working in Home Assistant since like September, I guess. But they weren't like, there were still some bugs, and then they released like a final version in December, final beta, and we updated to that, and they did their final rollout in February 14. And like throughout this, we've been working with Google and making sure that like everything we do is within like what they allow, and everything that and there were some bugs that we had to work out on both ends. But yeah, right now we're very close to getting live with that, and that's going to be exciting. I think when you talk to Google, it will be just like a little bit faster. I think the real speed increase for Google Home with Local SDK will come once Google is able to do a bunch of commands locally. So right now, if they on Android phones, their speech to text is really solid, like offline speech to text. So if they were ever be able to do that for the lights or something, right? Like turn on the lights and like it doesn't have to go through the Google Cloud, because right now actually the speech to text part and like processing it to an intent in the Google Assistant is like what's the slowest part. It's actually not Home Assistant Cloud. But once it can all be done local, I think then it will start moving very fast.
So when it becomes local, when we're using this local SDK, will people still need some form of Google, like a Home Assistant Cloud remote access to activate this integration?
Yes, because only the commands will be sent locally in very specific cases. So only if your Google Home is or your Google Assistant is on the same network and it can find your Home Assistant, and the device that is being controlled does not require two-factor authentication, like any security-related device is not allowed, for example. But if you, for example, will talk to your Android phone, it will still go through the cloud. If it's a 2FA device, it will go through the cloud. All the syncing is done through the cloud. So it's not like Home Assistant just, Google just finds a Home Assistant device and you get a pop-up in Home Assistant being like, hey, you want Google to control this device? And then like that's done. Like that would be the dream, of course, if that is the level of integration that we can get with like other products.
Yeah.
But until now, I mean, I would say that like 70 or 80% of your commands probably end up going through the local connection, but there would still be a cloud connection required.
Got it. So you're not completely disconnected.
No.
Right.
And also, I think when people hear the Google Local SDK, some people have been assuming that it allows us to control devices that are in Google Assistant that do not come from Home Assistant, like a Nest or like whatever you have in there. And that's not the case, right? This is only allowing Google to control us locally and not to for us to control Google.
That's interesting. So it's the other way around. Yeah. So Google has access to control Home Assistant entities and not the other way. Which I guess means you can't expose an entity from like that's connected to your Google Assistant into Home Assistant then, because it just won't exist.
Exactly.
Right.
And so from a technical perspective, the implementation is a pretty interesting approach because Google Homes and Google Home Mini, they have a Chromecast built in, right? And a Chromecast just runs JavaScript applications, which is like either for Chromecast audio or the Chromecast on your TV. It's just literally Google Chrome that is like showing you the video. And for this local SDK, it's actually also running a Home Assistant built JavaScript application. So we wrote a small JavaScript application that is able to communicate with Home Assistant, and then your Google Home will just spin up this like JavaScript application running on the device, it's kind of crazy, but it's cool. It works. So
that's cool.
Yeah.
Well, have you guys seen the new logos in the UI? The brand repository?
Yeah, like with Philips and all that.
But it's like my favorite contribution this year so far.
Yeah.
So this is like a project Frank has been working on. So we have this new repository with brands, and then we have these guidelines where like he made this like an icon has these requirements and a logo has these requirements, and then we went through our current logos and like most of them dropped out, like they were not good. And then the cool thing is that because this is how, of course, like we just crowdsource this repository, so we build out like this continuous integration. So Frank made sure that the guidelines we have is automatically checked when people make contributions.
Right.
So it means that the contribution just has to be reviewed. Like, hey, is this the actual logo? Is this the actual, icon?
Sure.
But after that, we can just merge it. And so we put out this repository, and then Frank created issues for all the logos that were missing. And then there's been like 5 people that have been like hacking on it, like crazy. And so within the last few weeks, we've been like all the most logos have been filled in right now. And it's also, you can see it like, it's funny because Frank was like, oh, I kind of generated my own Hacktoberfest because we have been seeing so many pull requests. Yeah. So just to kind of like give an indication, in the last 2 weeks, we've merged 1,200 pull requests.
Wow. That's crazy.
Yeah. And then, the normally we are around like 600. So that's like, it's double the amount.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, like I'm a really big fan of this. Like I think this is going to make the UI in Home Assistant a lot more user-friendly. Just a little change like this is a really cool feature.
Yeah, it helps so much with like discoverability. I think the next step is that we start adding, I want to create like a device database. And so the first step will be to allow people to upload photos for devices locally. Mm-hmm. But then the next step will be that people could share those photos that they use for their local devices with like the community. So that way we can, once devices get discovered, we already have like photos of each device that kind of pop up in your UI just to make it easier to scan a list, for example, to find a certain device or something.
Yep. That's cool. So then I could be looking at a light bulb and go, all right, yeah, I have that light bulb. Matches that. That's the one I want.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, Paulus, if there's nothing else, thank you so much for your time. Hopefully for all our listeners, hopefully this cleared up a lot of the confusion and lot of the stuff there, and yeah, it was a good update.
Awesome. Happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time. It's been always awesome talking to you.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Okay, take care.
If you want to share your Home Assistant journey or come on as a guest, reach out to us at feedback@haspodcast.io. That's HASS podcast.io.
The Home Assistant podcast is hosted by Phil Hawthorne and myself, Rohan Karamandi. For links to topics that we discussed today, check out our show notes on haspodcast.io.